The premier seaport in Texas in the 19th century was Galveston, a barrier island blessed with a natural harbor. Feeding into Galveston Bay is Buffalo Bayou, a river-like stream that flows from the west side of Houston. By the 1830s, speculators and investors were pouring into Texas, and two entrepreneurs from New York, the Allen brothers, arrived looking to purchase land. They bought a piece of property along Buffalo Bayou and founded a new town. They called it Houston, named for Texas hero General Sam Houston.
So even before the Allen family got to this part of Texas, there were a number of port projects all along the coast and along the various rivers and bayous here. And then when the Allen family did get here, they chose that confluence of White Oak and Buffalo bayous to site the city. Our whole reason for being is wrapped up with the port.
Right away, the Allen brothers went about building a wharf along Buffalo Bayou and laying out a street pattern with a main street connecting to the wharf. Today, that street grid is downtown Houston, and its main street connects with that original area called Allen's Landing.
The Port of Houston was at the foot of Main Street on Buffalo Bayou, where it met White Oak Bayou. And that started the minute Houston started. In 1836, when the Allen brothers came down, they carved a gash in one of the sandbars along the bayou, and we started bringing freight into the tent city of Houston.
The descriptions of the Allen's Landing in the 1830s are colorful, kind of a muddy place with all kinds of characters coming in from the frontier.
At first, Houston was little more than a camp town. Then the Allen brothers were successful in having it established as the temporary capital of the Republic of Texas. This made the town a hub of activity for business and government.
They were able to get Houston designated as the capital of Texas. Now, that didn't last very long, but what it did do was put the city on the map. So that was one of the strokes of genius by the Allen brothers.
The Allen brothers promoted their new town back east and were quite generous in their description of Houston's landscape.
They broadcast it and made illustrations showing wonderful rolling territory with some hills and various things that weren't exactly there, but it did bring a lot of people down.
From the day of its founding in 1836, Houston leaders had dreams of ocean-going vessels delivering cargo up the bayou to its docks. Galveston thought this idea absurd, a dream that would never happen. But it did turn out that barges and small steamboats would take on cargo at Allen's Landing.
And they would load cotton and lumber from that dock onto the very shallow bayou that then would travel to Galveston, where the cotton and lumber would be offloaded onto larger ships for export.
No one really knows the name of the first boat to come up Buffalo Bayou, but it was probably Jean Lafitte's. It's probably whose it was.
One of the early steamboats to work on Buffalo Bayou was the Cayuga.
The Cayuga was a side-wheeler. It was about 90 foot long. They brought everything, everybody and everything you wanted to call that would fit on that boat, they'd haul.
Buffalo Bayou was not always easy to navigate. Ship owners complained of fallen limbs and sunken boats, so the town formed an organization to collect funds to keep the bayou clear of obstructions and open to traffic. The city passed an ordinance in 1841 to build more public wharves and thus officially created the Port of Houston. Transportation in Texas was mostly by wagon or on horse or mule, often following primitive roads or muddy, obscure trails.
If you were going to go somewhere from Houston, your directions would essentially be, you want to head west along the Buffalo Bayou until it dries up, and you want to keep going until you come to the Brazos, take a right, head north for about 2 or 3 days. I mean, in some cases, maps just did not exist, and it didn't matter. The weather would be so bad, they'd be wet summers, wipe out the trail.
As a port, Buffalo Bayou would have a geographic advantage because it ran east and west and was fairly deep for navigation. Inbound cargoes could be offloaded at the town of Harrisburg and loaded onto wagons for the trip to other parts of Texas.
So by having an east-west orientation, it means that you could bypass Galveston and get to Houston and be 50 miles closer to your destination for freight.
Well, I have a painting of Buffalo Bayou that was done from best history they could come up with, and looked like it was a low-lying area with a lot of cypress trees, a lot of alligators and brush, and snags in the waterway.
Still, Galveston seemed destined to be the major port of Texas. With its closeness to deep water and its safe harbor, it considered itself the main entry into the region. However, as an island, it was hindered in transporting goods from ocean-going vessels to the interior of Texas.
Galveston had the catbird seat. It's right there at the Gulf, and everybody thought that was the right place to be. And so the Galveston Wharfage Company had very high prices.
But Houston quickly figured out a way to get around this.
They contacted ship captains and shippers, and what they did was said, just sail your ship into the bay, we'll send a barge out to meet you, we'll offload your goods, we'll do it for free, we'll bring it back up to Houston, you're already 50 miles inland.
The trip from Galveston to Houston took 10 hours if the weather and currents were favorable. By 1840, at least one steamship traveled between the two towns every day. It carried passengers, agricultural goods, and various products into and out of Texas.
These were shallow draft paddle wheelers, not much more than riverboats, and not the glamorous riverboats that you think of on the Mississippi. These were hard-working boats.
West of Houston were large cotton and sugar plantations, and the planters needed a way to get their crops to markets in the eastern U.S. Houston was the logical shipping point, and it began to grow as a center of trade.
But once the port got going, and really farming took hold in the area, cotton was king. Cotton really drove the growth of Houston commerce for a very long time.
That whole process was very complicated. It required a lot of expertise, a lot of business people who had knowledge of the whole world, how to send the cotton to other continents. That created our whole business-loving, optimistic culture.
By 1850, a railroad had been established in Houston, and soon a rail line was opened between Houston and Galveston. Before long, rail lines were fanning out in all directions from Houston, which had become the rail hub of Texas. When the Civil War began in 1861, Houston was no longer a camp town, but a growing business center.
Houstonians are an amazing group of people. They never let an obstacle stop them. Right when we got up ahead of steam, railroads were beginning to take shape and be built in the area. The Civil War broke out. Now, Houston, a lot of people don't realize, figured significantly because it was an ammunition depot for the Confederate Army.
After 4 years of bloody battles, the Civil War finally ended in 1865. Galveston leaders thought it would continue as the main port of Texas and paid little heed to upstart Houston with its narrow bayou. With the big demand for Texas cotton, Houston had become a major center of commerce. By 1873, its port was handling 75% of the goods transported to and from the interior of Texas. But it was obvious to city leaders that Buffalo Bayou would have to be widened and deepened. Houston wanted a deep water shipping channel that would stretch from the mouth of Galveston Bay up to the wharves in downtown.
The vision was always there, and what deep water meant evolved a little bit as things went along. So very early on, if you could bring a ship from New Orleans straight up into Galveston Bay and up Buffalo Bayou to Houston, that was a victory. And those things were beginning to happen.
But Houston, with its always aggressive leadership, immediately made plans to improve its facilities and the bayou. In 1870, Congress designated Houston a port of entry.
And that's highly important because then they stationed a customs agent there permanently.
Making Houston a deep-water port meant vessels could carry goods to foreign markets, not just Galveston.
And then after that, what began to happen is a series of surveys were conducted on Galveston and Buffalo Bayou with the idea of what would it take to actually dredge that out.
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began to survey the bayou and its possibilities. They determined it was not feasible to go all the way to downtown Houston and recommended that the widened channel terminate several miles east of there.
But as you get up into Buffalo Bayou, obviously, it's a serpentine route. It's not straight in any way. So yes, they had to very much straighten it out because as ships got bigger, making those turns are difficult.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Galveston was the leading business and financial center of Texas, calling itself the Wall Street of the Southwest. Even though Houston had a smaller population, it had become the railroad center of Texas. City leaders promoted it as the city where 17 railroads meet the sea. Goods that arrived at the port of Galveston had to pass through Houston, but Houston was not a deep-water port.
Well, there's a big competition in those days. I mean, Galveston was the established port, and they knew it, and they were proud of it, and they were accused of overcharging because they had a monopoly. So that was the impetus behind building the Houston Ship Channel.
Then, the 1900 storm devastated Galveston, killing more than 6,000 residents. Congress began to take seriously the idea of making Houston a deep-water port.
The 1900 storm was an awful chapter for Galveston. I don't think anybody can argue that. But I think Galveston was going to lose the battle no matter what. Houston was already building the rail infrastructure. Galveston could not pedal fast enough to make it worthwhile. And really, they didn't have the ability to do that. You already had a rail center in Houston. Galveston had one line leaving the island, and it still went to Houston.
The discovery of oil in the region would certainly add to the need for a bigger port.
When Spindletop opened up and the oil economy grew, it was sited here. We're not actually the closest city to Spindletop, but because we already had that business enterprise, all that knowledge, all that social capital here, it came to Houston.
Tom Ball was the congressman from Houston and was often called the father of the port. He served on the important Harbors and Rivers Committee. Ball worked hard to make sure that the interests of Houston were represented in Washington.
The conventional wisdom of the day was, okay, wait, you're going to put a port 50 miles inland? What are you thinking?
Houston argued that they had the rail connections, and it made economic sense for their channel to be a deep-water port.
Because Houston could say, bring your goods here, and it's just a little hop onto a train, and then your goods go anywhere in North America.
Houstonians believed the U.S. government wasn't moving fast enough to allocate the funds, so Houston decided to finance part of the dredging itself.
Those people came up with what was called the Houston Plan. Congress had never seen before, but it was a way of sharing the cost 50-50. Houston was to come up with $1,250,000, and the federal government was to do the same.
On November 10, 1914, Houstonians gathered at the turning basin for the official opening of the Houston Ship Channel and the Port of Houston.